and welcome everybody to the last installment of our speaker series for this year, but that's not the last one of the speaker series. We will resume in January, so stay tuned for updates on our speakers and themes. But since it's the last in the year, I would like to thank our sponsors, UC Investment, and Jagdeep Bachar is on the call with us today, and Division of Social Sciences, Institute for Social Transformation, and especially Joni White, our wonderful coordinator, and her team for making it all happen. And of course, I also would like to thank our speakers, our moderators, and our guests for that has been so far really an exciting set of exciting conversations. Today, our speaker is Barry Eichengreen, and the moderator is Grace Gu. Grace Gu is the professor of economics at UC Santa Cruz and a member of the steering committee of the CAFIN. And I'm not going to take any more of their time.
Thank you very much, Galina, for the introduction. So I'm honored here to introduce our speaker today, Professor Barry Eichengreen. He is the George Pardee and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. He's also a research associate of National Bureau of Economic Research at Cambridge, Massachusetts, and research fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research at London, England. During 1997 to 98, he was senior policy advisor at the IMF. He is currently a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So Professor Eichengreen has held multiple fellowships and has been an active fellow in multiple research institutions and a regular monthly columnist for Project Syndicate. He's also written many interesting books. One of my personal favorite is Hall of Mirrors, The Great Depression and the Great Recession and the misuses of history. So I've enjoyed reading that book a lot. And I know he also have recent books coming out too. So Professor Eichengreen was awarded numerous prizes for his excellence in teaching and research. And one last thing I would like to say is Professor Eichengreen is a treasured undergraduate alumnus from UC Santa Cruz as well. Okay, so without further ado, let's have Professor Barry Eichengreen to tell us about emerging market economies during the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you, Galina. Thank you, Grace. Grace, you can give me the thumbs up. You can see that? Very good.
Yes, we can see the slide.
Excellent. So I am always happy to be back at Santa Cruz. It brings back memories, and I'm happy for this invitation because it forced me to try to confront some anomalies in the emerging market debt space at the moment, try to understand them as they unfold around us, and to draw some policy implications from them as well. So when the pandemic struck back in February and March, many of us, I include myself, expected a tsunami of debt restructurings by emerging markets in trouble. That hasn't happened, at least yet. So far, there have been only 6 defaults and 2 restructurings, which I list here mostly due to pre-existing conditions, not COVID. I would note parenthetically that 6 defaults in a calendar year is a relatively large number by historical standards, but it's many fewer. Here you see the historical standards on the right, but it's many fewer than I, for example, would have anticipated back in February and March. So the relevant question is, why not more? And I think the relevant answers include COVID's impact on developing countries, in particular, developing countries in Africa, has been less than feared at the time. That reflects in part relatively young populations, less susceptible to the virus, relatively experienced public health systems that have dealt with other epidemics past. There's the fact that China has recovered relatively successfully and relatively rapidly and brought other emerging market exports, commodity exports along with it. But of course, there is above all the Fed and the European Central Bank, which have cut interest rates to rock bottom levels and flooded markets with liquidity and activated a flight to yield, where the yield on offer tends to be in emerging markets. So I downloaded this figure on the right from JP Morgan last night, and it shows you what's happened in terms of retail bond flows into emerging markets. They collapsed, of course, during the early stages of the pandemic, when there was a scramble for liquidity on the part of investors, and when the kind of fears that I felt back in March were more widespread. And then, interestingly, they quickly stabilized already in April, and funds have been flowing quite steadily back into emerging market fixed income since, to the surprise of, I shouldn't say many of us, I should say of me, a number of countries, Peru, Guatemala, Brazil, Egypt, Indonesia, Kenya, have been able to issue new foreign currency bonds over the spring, the summer, and the fall. And a number of these economies have been able to issue domestically as well. So that's impressive, but I think that's also a bit anomalous. Nigeria recently has been able to issue 91-day treasury bills at negative yields. Nigeria is running what, a 10% inflation rate? One presumes with a 10% inflation rate, the currency is not going to appreciate against the dollar or the euro, and yet yields are negative. So this strikes me as peculiar. It strikes me as a candidate for Stein's law, Herb Stein famously having said, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. The question being how and when it will stop. It's worth observing that this recent experience is not typical. We have seen advanced countries' central banks cut interest rates to zero and engage in quantitative easing. So here you see, for example, a comparison of the current COVID experience with the global financial crisis in blue. It took much longer for capital to begin to flow back into emerging markets in the case of the global financial crisis. It took much longer for funds to begin to flow back into emerging markets after the 2015 China shock, when the Chinese stock market crashed and they tightened up their capital controls, and there was a flurry of unease in the emerging market space. So why this time is different is an interesting question. I don't have an answer, but maybe it's something else that we can talk about when we get to the second half of the hour. So this fact has enabled emerging markets to do quite a bit on the fiscal front, which again is very different from periods of stress in the past. I'm not denying that they feel financial constraints. They've been able to do considerably less than advanced economies. So on the right, you can see the IMF's fiscal tracker for, I think this is the G20 countries, showing both additional spending and tax cuts and loan guarantees and their equivalent. So emerging markets tend to be down on the left, doing less fiscally. Emerging markets tend to do more in terms of guarantees as opposed to outright spending. By this measure, Italy now qualifies as an emerging market. But you can see that nonetheless, some emerging markets, Brazil, South Africa, have been able to do quite a bit of fiscal stimulus in response to the crisis without their currencies crashing. Their currencies may have weakened, but they haven't crashed. And that additional fiscal action has been supported by the capital inflows that I talked about previously. Here's another look in terms of emerging markets as a group and emerging markets ex-China. China has more fiscal space for a variety of obvious reasons, from capital controls to coming into the crisis with a relatively low level of central government debt relative to GDP. But again, by historical standards, 2020 is an outlier. What happened in 2008, 2009 was very much China. As you can see here, China has done less stimulus this time around, concerned, I think, that more stimulus for heavy industry and construction and so forth would frustrate ongoing efforts to rebalance the economy away from heavy industry, away from SOEs, away from investment as opposed to consumption. As a result, general government debt as a share of GDP, excluding China, will increase by 10% this year. So in the emerging market space, I think there is no precedent for that, not even during the 1970s, during the Latin American borrowing binge, did the general government debt to GDP ratio increase by that much in a single year. Over the course of the 1970s, there was a considerable increase, and we know how that ended. It didn't end well. I'm not a believer in magic numbers, but Reinhard Rogoff-Savastano had an article called Debt Intolerance about emerging markets, where they argued that 35% of GDP was kind of a number after which you should start to worry about the sustainability and stability of emerging market debt. If we believe the interest rate environment today is different than when they wrote that article in the early 2000s, then maybe we should rethink that number a little bit, but it's a focal point for putting what we see today in perspective. The question being whether the interest rate environment really is that different for emerging markets as opposed to mature markets. So here in the global north, we can take a more relaxed attitude toward the accumulation of debt because interest rates are so much lower than they've been historically. Paul Krugman reminded us of that in the New York Times this morning, but that's not true to the same extent of emerging markets. If you think that the flows toward emerging markets that we've seen beginning in May will be sustained, then the interest rate environment and the burden of servicing increased debts will change will moderate for emerging markets, just like the mature economies. But if you have doubts like those I feel about the sustainability of recent events and recent flows, then maybe you should continue to extrapolate on the basis of this figure that I show you on the right, which points to a divergence in debt servicing prospects between emerging markets and mature markets. A lot of the new domestic debt is, a lot of the new emerging market debt is domestic currency denominated, floated on domestic markets. But as I write here, that's cold comfort, because a lot of it is being purchased by foreign investors. And as Yun Shin and his co-authors reminded us, recently, domestic debt, being able to issue debt on domestic markets is no panacea. Restructuring domestic debt is easier, and that may in fact be a big deal going forward, because domestic debt is governed by local law, and local law can be changed by edict or act of the local legislature. Foreign debt is governed by English law typically, or state of New York law, and that introduces some additional complications to which I will return. But the point of Mr. Shin and his co-authors is that domestic currency debt is likely to be equally volatile, or maybe even more volatile than foreign currency denominated debt when markets begin to misbehave, because foreign investors will suffer the double whammy of experiencing both a decline in local currency bond prices when markets retrench, and a decline in the exchange rate when markets retrench. And the latter may be a larger problem for their portfolios, even than for the portfolios of domestic investors. Foreign investors may run to an even greater extent. So problems may be coming, especially for low-income countries, especially for countries that rely for income on tourism, on oil exports, on remittances, all of which have taken a big hit, as you can see here on the right. Problems are coming sooner rather than later. So the Institute of International Finance reminds us that there's a lot of debt that's going to have to be serviced and repaid already in 2021. There is a bunching aggravated by the fact that a lot of local currency, relatively short-term debt has been incurred recently, and that's going to have to be rolled over or paid off already in 2021. So this is not a problem down the road. This is potentially a problem that could materialize in the relatively short run. So explain Thailand to me, given all that. This is a tourism-dependent economy. I think 10% of the country's foreign earnings comes from people going to Phuket or wherever. They're having ongoing demonstrations in the street. The prospects for the political system are clouded. When people ask me, when do financial crises occur? I say when you have a combination of two things, financial fragility and political fragility, so that the government cannot respond to the financial problems forcefully. Thailand would seem to qualify, and yet capital is flooding in. So I infer that a yield of 1.35% on 10-year Thai bonds is attractive when European bond yields are negative, and when US bond yields are below 1% and the dollar is expected to depreciate. So that may be what investors are thinking and acting on at the moment. The question will be, how long does it go on, and what happens if and when it ends? So one of my former students sent me last week, I think, this screenshot from Bloomberg. And if you look at the column above the arrow, you can see emerging market exchange rates against the dollar. They've all been strengthening. They're all expected to strengthen on a 6-month basis against the dollar. So again, you can see the impact on emerging markets, and it's not unambiguously positive. Another way to interpret all the green is loss of competitiveness going forward. So how does this end? You tell me. I can imagine a number of scenarios. Scenario one is that investors wake up and see the tenuous of the position in emerging markets, and that coincides with a Fed decision to normalize the level of interest rates, ending the scramble for yield. That's the combination of events that led to the taper tantrum and has led to sudden stops in capital flows throughout history. So scenario number two is that interest rates in the advanced economies remain low for long. Currently, financial market participants anticipate that they will remain low for long. If you look at swap rates, or you look at the difference between interest rates on inflation index treasuries minus rates on non-index treasuries of the same maturity. So if you're an investor anticipating this, and evidently the majority of investors are in this camp, why not keep pouring money into higher yielding sovereigns? And scenario three, I think, is the one I prefer. In economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will. This goes on for a while, and then when it stops, it stops in more violent fashion. Then things happen faster than you think they could. Rudy Dornbush, circa 1997. So what has the international policy community done about this, and what more can it do? You'll probably know that the G20 announced a debt service suspension initiative. This is basically a 1.5-year suspension on obligations to the International Monetary Fund on monies lent previously, and a 1-year deferral for poor countries. This is not for middle income emerging markets, for poor countries on their bilateral government to government obligations. A deferral, not forgiveness, so interest continues to accrue in the meantime, and that's part of the 2021 problem that I alluded to before, and a call for private sector participation. So we've seen 2 iterations of this DSSI now, one after the spring meetings of the fund and bank in April, another one after the October meetings. In the first time, the group of 20 encouraged the private sector to participate. In the second one, they're gonna directly ask the private sector to participate. Will that make a difference? Will it happen? I'm gonna argue I don't think so. And in the meanwhile, the IMF has dispersed some monies, but only a relatively little bit. It may want to hold some back for the next shock when it comes, but still, one would think they should have been more active already. So that's what's been done. What more can the international policy community now do? There's the Paris Club problem. So to remind you, the Paris Club is the club of rich country governments that has extended government-to-government loans and aid of various sorts to poor and middle-income countries. The Paris Club has existed since the Latin American debt crisis, since the beginning of the 1980s. Therefore, changes in the structure of the world economy, like the rise of China, are not fully reflected in the structure of the Paris Club. So China is now an observer at the Paris Club. Its officials meet through WebEx with the other members of the Paris Club, and that's important because debt to China exceeds all other government-to-government debt for emerging markets as a group. And it almost exceeds, if your eyesight is good, and you can see this in the figure on the right, all other government-to-government debt plus bonded debt. The figures on the right are estimates because we don't know exactly how much money different emerging market governments owe to China. The Paris Club has disclosure rules, but China is not a member, so it hasn't been obliged to disclose. Carmen Reinhardt and others have done heroic work to try to construct figures like those I show you on the right, but the uncertainty is a problem for figuring out how to proceed. And the uncertainty is a problem because other governments are not going to forgive the debt of emerging markets if the extra resources they thereby provide simply allow those emerging markets to pay off its Chinese creditors. So the big uncertainty here, I think, has revolved around the China Construction Bank. One of the, it's not exactly a state bank, but it's an entity of the Chinese government. Initially, back in the spring, the Chinese government said China Construction Bank loans are commercial credits. They shouldn't be subject to the DSSI. I think some of those loans have now been extended by the China Construction Bank. So there may be progress on that front, but the issue of whether China is going to fully participate in the DSSI remains to be clarified, at least so far as I know. More resources for the IMF would reassure the institution that it could loan generously now and still have resources for the 2021 problem. A new allocation of special drawing rights to the members could give those members themselves more resources when they need them. Problem with SDR allocations is the single largest recipient of a new SDR allocation would, of course, be the United States, which has 17% of the total quotas in the fund. So those SDRs would sit idly on the balance sheets of the advanced economies. People would ask whether this is a sensible way to get a modicum of additional resources to emerging markets and developing countries if it benefits mainly the high income countries. So there have been proposals over the years of how that allocation could be pooled, donated back to the fund and reallocated directly to the countries in the most need. Additional SDRs were allocated in 2009. I do not recall that they were voluntarily pooled and reallocated at that time. Something like that might be easier with a Biden administration as opposed to a Trump administration, which previously insisted that the IMF and its members through this channel already had adequate resources. The IMF charges 4% on its loans, which is a lot more than other creditors typically get post restructuring. And this has historically been a reflection of Bagehot's rule that lenders of last resort should lend freely at a penalty rate, the penalty rate being designed to discourage excessive borrowing by the members. Excessive borrowing by the members is not the problem today. They haven't been queuing up in exceptionally large lenders, exceptionally large numbers at the fund's conventional facilities. The IMF has extra protection. It attaches conditions to its loans. It's senior creditor. It gets paid before other private sector creditors, so that there hasn't been more discussion about the idea that it should lower its interest rate on its loans under current conditions is, I think, a bit surprising. So this point is a point of emphasis in a memo that Peter Orszag wrote for the fund and of the bank on behalf of the Peterson Institute. It's important, I think, to encourage more countries to participate in the DSSI. Last time I looked, only 46 of 73 low-income countries have taken this up so far, and most of the debt interest payments on which it has been extended is debt of only two countries, Pakistan and Angola. I think there are fears that countries that resort to the DSSI will suffer reputational damage, that they will be downgraded by the rating agencies. So there was more boilerplate in the revised DSSI statement in October that the rating agencies should be asked not to downgrade countries that resort to it. Maybe asking as instructing or legislating is not enough. And finally, countries that resort to the DSSI are discouraged from issuing bonds on the grounds that it would be kind of perverse for them to get forgiveness on some of their current obligations and then be able to incur new obligations. And this apparently is why some countries like Kenya didn't initially sign up. The most pressing problem, I think, is to deal with the private creditor problem, what I call here private creditor free riding. In April, the G20 delegated this problem to the Institute of International Finance, which is the lobby of the private creditors, the organization of the private creditors. I regard that as letting the fox into the henhouse, in a sense. And the IIF released a statement saying that private creditors have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors. They should proceed on a case-by-case basis, which meant in practice that nothing happened. The updated statement last month, the so-called common framework, repeated, the G20 repeated what it said before in very slightly strengthened form about the desirability of private sector participation. And meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund put out a paper, a couple of papers with some ideas about how to deal with these problems in the future. So bond contracts might include automatic stays, which would kick in automatically under circumstances like these. Collective action clauses should be simplified, streamlined, and strengthened. Single limb aggregation basically means one grand vote of the bondholders to implement a stay or restructure a country's debts. Those are all useful things going forward, and a number of us have been writing about and advocating those ideas, not only this year, but like for my own writing on this goes back more than 2 decades about the desirability of collective action clauses and the like. we need to think more about this. Automatic stays can cause investors to scramble out in advance of the stay. But I think these are broadly speaking constructive ideas, the problem being that they're fine for dealing with the next crisis. We're always really good at thinking about how to deal with the next crisis. We have to deal first with the current one. What can be done about this? The ideas out there include changing governing law, New York state law and English law, to prevent holdout creditors from suing sovereigns when that sovereign has an IMF program in place. An act of parliament or an executive order by President Biden could halt litigation in the context of restructurings, could halt the attachment of central bank reserves or revenues from petroleum exports in the context of restructurings. The most ambitious idea, due to Mitu Gulati and co-authors, is that the UN Security Council could adopt a resolution protecting the assets of restructuring countries like it did once before. In 2003, it protected the foreign reserves of the Central Bank of Iraq and the country's petroleum export revenues in the context of protected them from attachment in the context of that debt restructuring, where then enabling legislation and an executive order from President Bush, I believe, actually implemented that idea. So these are ways to go. Realistically, I don't think any of these things are going to happen. So I think we're going to have a big problem on our hands sometime down the road, maybe as early as 2021, because these are fine ideas, and I do not see the political economy, frankly, the political will in the US and the UK or globally to make them happen. So if other people on the call have different views, I would be reassured to hear them. Other things can make restructuring easier. So one reason restructuring Argentine debt was so difficult was different parties had different views of how quickly the economy would grow and how much debt servicing capacity the country would have going forward. GDP index bonds solved that problem because depending on the interest payments will adjust with the growth rate. So there are good ideas out there, but they address the next problem more than they address the current one. So the vaccine is coming. That's good news. It's better news for emerging markets than it is for advanced countries like the United States, because anti-vax skepticism is less in emerging markets, which have had experience with the benefits of vaccines because of epidemics past. So maybe that's a ray of sunlight on which to end. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. So I think we have a couple of questions. So I think Galina has a question.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna kick it off. So Barry, you talked mostly about the government debt and the extent of the problems and the solutions. How important do you think is the role of private foreign debt for emerging markets, given that you mentioned a little bit the Chinese demand recovered relatively quickly, but it clearly didn't recover to the levels we've seen before the onset of the crisis. And so how much impact does it have on private companies that finance themselves internationally in mining sector and outside of the mining sector? And another question, do you think the the issue of a stigma for the low-income countries that have been doing relatively well in a pre-COVID world and would like to not go back to the debt restructuring state they were at, let's say 10, 20 years ago? Do you think that is an issue? And if so, what could be done about that?
The corporate debt problem is very real and pressing, and I would acknowledge that I'm less of an expert on that than I am on sovereign debt. And this is true also of a number of my friends, people I talk to about these markets. Corporate debt is more of a problem for some countries than others. The burden is much heavier for China than it is for most other emerging markets, depending on what you count, 160, 170, 180% of GDP. So China ends up being very heavily indebted if you add the corporate debt to the household debt, more modest to the central government debt, to the local government debt. And corporate debt for a number of countries, for middle-income emerging markets, is difficult to restructure, again, because it is external debt as opposed to domestic to a greater extent than has been the case for emerging market sovereigns in recent years. Galina, your second question was about low-income countries wanting to avoid having to restructure debts because they have gained market access recently and they don't want to lose it. Is that right?
Yes, yes, basically. Or just more broadly, reputation that maybe goes beyond the market access.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have more to say about that, but I do think that contributes to the observed reluctance of a surprising number of countries to resort to the DSI and restructure more broadly. So the only countries that have suspended debt service payments or restructured, as I said before, are a handful of countries that came into the crisis with very severe pre-existing problems and therefore basically no market access.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. There are several questions from the audience as well. So from G. Bush, the question is, what do you think are the biggest financial stability issues for emerging markets in the next 12 months? So in terms of individual countries and the contingent contagious risk across countries?
So I hesitate to point my finger at individual countries, probably not good policy on a call like this, and out of self-protection, because I've been pointing to the same countries for years now, and I'll keep pointing to them until I'm right. Some countries that struck me as motoring directly toward the brick wall have been able to avoid it, to my own surprise, and that has something to do with the surprising resilience of flows into emerging markets that I described before. You know, all I'm going to say in response to that is I have a short list of candidate countries that I'm worried about. They're the same countries I've been worried about for a while now. They haven't blown up, but I am cognizant of Rudy Dornbusch's point about it takes longer than you think, and then it's worse than you ever believed when it finally comes.
Yeah, it's like a ticking bombs, right? So I remember you, in a talk you mentioned, for certain countries that's prone to, they have a big tourist sector, those countries that could be heavily affected by COVID especially. And so perhaps those are some of the countries that their industry composition, from there we can infer their individual risk as well.
Right. In addition, there are developing countries around the world that rely on remittances for, in Central America, as much as half of their foreign income. And that income has been vaporized by the crisis. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so another question from Michael Hutchinson. So he asked, why do you sound pessimistic regarding action on the part of the US with the new incoming administration? What's your political economy argument that hindering the emerging market debt restructuring?
Well, maybe I haven't fully taken on board, like certain members of the Republican Party, that we really are going to have a change of administration in the second half of January. I'm skeptical because I think the new administration is going to be focusing its limited political capital on priority items. I think there inevitably will be pushback from investors who would otherwise rush to the courthouse if their ability to do so was eliminated by the new administration. So if Michael is more optimistic, we're going to have to talk more about that. I would like to be more optimistic about the point. Will there be a consensus in the UN Security Council for a resolution like this? Is China going to be on board with that? I have been told, I do believe that China has not been an obstacle to all of these discussions. So maybe there is hope there as well.
So a related question by Stacy Williams, that she asked, how do you see a Biden administration change the U.S. policy in emerging markets, especially for Latin American countries?
Well, I think the lines of communication will be open in ways that they haven't been previously. I think that a Biden administration will understand better that one of the ways you address Americans' concerns about immigration is through more prosperity at home. So I think it will be more aware of that, more engaged, less disruptive on the trade policy front, all of which will be good.
In a presentation, you also mentioned other countries' concern, especially advanced countries in the Paris Club, their concern about China. And they've been urging China to join the club, but China has been hesitating to. So would you elaborate a little bit more on their concern about how the Chinese creditors taking on debt forgiveness for emerging countries? And has China been making any progress on this front?
There's a social club in London called the Groucho Club. After Groucho Marx's quip, "I wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have me." So maybe that applies here as well. I think there is, I think China will become a member of the Paris Club. It's easy to make a forecast as long as one is careful not to attach a date to it. I think China has some understandable reluctance. This is the Groucho problem, to join a club whose rules have been set by others, and whose rules may ask it, as the largest bilateral creditor, to make the largest concessions on the basis of rules and voting conventions that were set before it became a member. But I do think the Chinese understand this. I think Chinese officials understand the advantages of multilateralism and multilateral organizations in ways that the outgoing US administration did not. So they will become a member of the Paris Club, because ultimately it will benefit them as well if there is some coordination in how debt reduction, bilateral debt reduction, is achieved.
Mm-hmm. Those are all very difficult questions, right? There's hard predictions to make. You mentioned credit ratings in your talk. How do you think, how important do you think they are for emerging markets? Should investors be watching for sovereign downgrades?
Credit ratings are a reliable lagging indicator of what's going on in the markets. That we know credit rating agencies respond to events, and they're not necessarily the best at predicting events going forward. Again, I'm trying to be polite and choose my words here carefully. This, I think this has been a problem for a long time. It is the case that the regulations and rules governing what institutional investors can do give credit rating agencies a lot of power, or give their decisions a lot of impact. That if something is no longer investment grade, certain kinds of institutional investors are required by their own covenants or by regulation to dump that stuff, so that the cost of borrowing, the extent of the market, does depend importantly on what they do. This has been observed to be a problem really ever since the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, when rating agencies responded after the fact in this way, and that aggravated the problems in the Asian crisis countries, and a variety of things have been proposed to, for example, to not to write regulations, financial regulations, on the basis of what rating agencies do, that capital charges are a function of the average rating of the assets in a financial institution's portfolio or something. Get rid of that kind of stuff, the argument would go. And I think there has been some progress over the intervening 20 years at loosening those links, but those links are still there. Whether that could be altered at the moment through executive order or by regulatory diktat by financial regulators in different countries, I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, so the reforms for the credit rating agencies has been a long discuss.
These are among the things that come back each time we begin to think about the next crisis.
Yeah, yeah. So this is has to do with one of the audience questions, but also with one of my questions as well. So do you think so both the COVID-19 crisis is obviously a global crisis, and so it has impact to each individual countries, no matter you're emerging countries or advanced countries. But then there could also be a lot of spillover between emerging countries and developed countries. So one audience asks, so what do you see, what are the spillovers from emerging countries to developed countries? The second question is from me, what do you think about in terms of US recovery, the speed of US recovery could impact back to emerging countries?
So the United States is 20 to 25% of the global economy still. So how our recovery develops from here, whether we now get a double dip or because of the vaccine we don't, will be of first order importance for what happens in developing countries and emerging markets. The world is becoming more multipolar, and we've already seen this year that what happens in emerging markets, what's been happening in China in terms of their ability to grow again now on a sustained basis is important for the rest of the world. So I'm not among those folks who run or look at global models like the ones that the IMF and others run to try to quantify these linkages. But this pandemic is a reminder of how interdependent we all are.
Right. Yeah. So you think that U.S. spillover to the emerging countries are the most important aspect that we should watch?
Well, so there are three big, the three biggest economies are the U.S.,
as well as China as well,
and China. Yeah. So clearly they carry the most weight when you think about the global economy and when you think about spillovers.
Yeah. And related to the U.S., so the Fed has extended a lot of conventional monetary policy to new policies during the COVID crisis. So one thing that's related to emerging markets was the Fed has extended supports to swap for dollars for a lot of foreign central banks. If I remember right, they have broadened the list of countries. So how do you see this kind of new policy impact on the emerging countries' economy during the crisis?
We had all kinds of liquidity problems in the markets back in March, and I think there was justified concern at the time that if financial distress in other countries forced them to dump US Treasury bonds in order to raise liquidity, that would only compound the problems that the Fed was dealing with already. So that's the justification for swap lines. If I recall correctly, the swap lines that were activated were exactly the same as the ones that had been put in place in 2008, which means they all went to advanced economies with the exception of 4, Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, and South Korea. And I believe that's the case again. Now, the difference is that the terms of the swaps have been enhanced, longer and cheaper, which is helpful. Another point that we always come back to when we begin to think about crises, this one has been around for 20 years, as well as the global financial safety net and the fact that some countries get swaps and others don't, is access to dollars through the IMF, an adequate substitute to access to dollars from the Fed. We can reliably anticipate that there will be challenges for threats to central bank independence going forward. We are in a more polarized political environment. And if you saw the party line vote on the new member of the Federal Reserve Board yesterday, that's an indication that, even such things as central bank independence are going to be eroded by the more polarized political environment. So will a future Fed be in the position to do what this Fed has done? Answer would be hopefully so, but unclear. Is there a better way of organizing these swaps through the IMF or something like that?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think there are any other questions? Okay. So maybe one last question, if I may. So you mentioned reforms on the state contingent bonds for the emerging countries. So I've read there are proposals about bandy bonds. So basically, let the borrowers lengthen their maturity quickly in return for extra interest at the end of the bond's extended life. And so there are, different kind of proposals for state contingent. So this is one of them. How do you see those kind of maturity lengthening proposals?
I think that they are one of the more interestingly named examples of a whole range of securities. Yeah. Which do have a role to play in increasing the automaticity with which we deal with these kind of problems. So I view it as exactly the same argument as people make for automatic fiscal stabilizers, that it's hard to do discretionary fiscal policy in timely fashion and so forth, but automatic stabilizers kick in immediately and automatically. So contingent securities with automatic stay provisions or maturity lengthening provisions do the same thing. I skipped over my slide about the obstacles to their wider implementation. These ideas have been around for a long time too, and the question is why they haven't already been more widely adopted. There is the first mover problem. That if everybody hasn't already moved, the market in these new securities is going to be specialized and not particularly liquid. There is the trigger problem. It is the who's going to be able to unilaterally announce that the maturity has been lengthened, or is there some external indicator that will automatically do that, and what will that external indicator that cannot be manipulated by the principles actually be? I think these are all problems that can be solved, and they take political will to solve them for countries to move together, including high-income countries, and then you will begin to get the relevant market.
Thank you very much, Professor Barry Eichengreen. It is a very wonderful talk. So now this is the end of our talk and the whole series. So on behalf of CAFIN, I would like to thank all of our speakers and our sponsors, UC Investments, Division of Social Sciences, Institute for Social Transformation, for making this talk series possible. So CAFIN will continue the talk series of financial risk, innovation, and inclusion in a post-COVID world in January, and we hope to see everyone here again. Have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you too.